U.S. President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump have clinched their party's presidential nominations with decisive victories yesterday in a slate of low-profile primaries. But the magnitude of their wins gave each man the delegate majority needed to claim his party's nomination at the summertime national conventions. Their new presumptive nominee status sets up a November general election rematch between two unpopular presidents that most voters don't want. And now that the general election has been solidified, Forum Daily is pleased to announce that we will be launching a weekly U.S. election tracker segment with Wyatt Sharpe. And joining me now in studio is Wyatt Sharpe. Wyatt Sharpe, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Now, you represent a younger demographic in Canada. Why should young Canadians care about news?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, especially with the time that we're in right now, where so many of these headlines, everyone's talking about what it means for the present and for those demographics of Canadians who are actually working, for example, and have a career in the workplace. But I think what a lot of people perhaps don't recognize is the fact that young people are the leaders of tomorrow. They are going to be the people who are going to be affected by some of these decisions that are being made. And so not only is it important to care about them, but it's also important to make your voice heard, to get out there, whether it's, a form of activism or whether it's what I'm doing through interviewing people, asking questions, which is kind of just driven by, I guess, a natural curiosity in kind of what's happening. It started kind of around, at the height of the pandemic, when people were kind of quarantined in their houses. They didn't have a lot going on. And of course, I was one of those many people, like, hundreds of thousands of millions of other younger Canadians. And so really, it was kind of something that started then, continued afterwards, and now here I am.
Well, it's great to have you. And for your weekly election tracker, what do you have in store for us, and what do you hope that the viewers will bring, will understand, will get out of this from the U.S.?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because when we look at the U.S. and kind of the dynamics at play right now, we see that the majority of Americans don't want Donald Trump or Joe Biden to be the president, and yet somehow each of them still wound up being the presumptive nominees for each of their respective parties. And so when we look at what's happening in Canada and some of the issues that Canadians are being affected by, Americans are being affected by many of the same issues. And so it's really important, I think at least, to give Canadians an understanding of what's happening in the U.S., because oftentimes what happens in the U.S. ends up being kind of an indication of what can happen in Canada, for example. And so we're launching it tomorrow. We have a great first interview with Asa Hutchinson, who ran in the presidential race. So he obviously has some insight as it relates to that, but also the fact that he did not endorse Donald Trump after dropping out. He's been very outspoken against Donald Trump, which is interesting because we see right now kind of a coronation, so to speak, behind Donald Trump amongst the Republican Party. Even throughout the primary, we saw a lot of people hesitant to criticize Donald Trump. Can't really say the same about Asa Hutchinson, who, as I said, has been pretty vocal against him.
Now, despite your age, you've interviewed some very notable public figures. Tell me about some of your most notable interviews.
Yeah, so I kind of started when I first doing my interviews primarily Canadian, right? And they were all Canadian based. So during the last election campaign in 2021, I spoke to Justin Trudeau and Aaron O'Toole, who were, of course, Aaron O'Toole's no longer the leader, but at the time he was running against Justin Trudeau. And then also as it relates to some international headlines as well. So for example, whether it's the war in Ukraine or most recently the war in Israel, I've spoken to people from both of those two governments, asking them questions about kind of the dynamics at play. And then with the presidential election as well, I've spoken to some of the candidates. Back when Vivek Ramaswamy was running, I spoke with him. He obviously was someone who was fairly influential at the time. He dropped out, endorsed Donald Trump, and as it stands right now, he is, not in the race, but he's still playing a fairly pivotal role. And so it's really kind of looking at the headlines and kind of trying to find someone who can best speak on those issues, whether it's people who are, directly connected to the issue, people who perhaps have some form of personal history as it relates to the issue. And so just trying to make it as simple as possible for the viewer.
But what sparked you at such a young age to be so interested in this, in news?
Yeah, it was, as I said, I think particularly with COVID, but then also it started during COVID because I was watching, various news channels and seeing what was actually happening in our world, and specifically how leaders were adapting and responding to some of these challenges. And when that happened, I started emailing different politicians. And originally what happened was, I think it was Aaron O'Toole actually suggested, why don't we have a Zoom meeting and we talk about some of these issues that you expressed. And so it kind of continued from there. And then I started emailing other people as well. And then eventually I started asking them to join me via Zoom for conversation. And then I thought, why not publish these conversations for other people to benefit from them in the same way that I was?
I think this is wonderful. We're so excited to have you on the News Forum. Thank you so much for joining us today and joining us weekly
Thank
with
you
your
so much.
weekly election tracker.
Of course.